Well, hello, creatives, community, and kind folks. Welcome to RPG with DBJ. Of course, I am your host, DBJ, surrounded by the most brilliant of all of you out there. Of course, the creatives, the community, and the kind folks out there in the tabletop RPG community. So, our series talking about movies and TV to tabletop RPGs. This one is a little bit of a special one, simply because I pretty much feel this doesn't fall quite into the excellent premise, terrible execution category, but it was a bit of a request. So, and a childhood favorite of mine, although it's still going on today, and that is Gundam, the progenitor of the very nature of mecha in the anime geekdom, geekosphere. It's crazy how many series and spin-offs and how much life this series has given us. And by itself, it spawned its own like subgenre of anime, even within the mecha or mechanized creative space. So let's dig into it. Okay, Gundam is a pretty old series. As a matter of fact, the franchise features giant robots with the name Gundam. The franchise began in April 1979. That's why I remember it from my childhood. With Mobile Suit Gundam, a TV series that defined the real robot mecha anime genre by featuring giant robots called mobile suits, including the original titular mecha, in a militaristic setting. And the popularity of the series and its merchandise spawned a franchise that includes 50 TV series, films, OVAs, as well as manga, novels, and video games, along with a whole industry of plastic model kits, known as Gunpla, which makes up 90% of the Japanese character plastic model market. Um, from my own personal experience, growing up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was a street known as South Street, and everyone who was anyone that was part of counterculture went to tried to live on and work on South Street. So long before dyeing your hair and having tattoos was a cool thing, uh, counterculture, this was the place to go. And there was this store there that was packed from floor to ceiling with imports, because at the time, and here, like I said, we're talking 80s, early 80s, that you could not find any of these toys anywhere. And they weren't really toys in the classic sense, they were model kits. And man, they had a lot of detail. And I just remember building many of them. I don't have any of them left at all as a kid, but man, I love them. Deadman says some Gundam series are perfect examples of excellent premise, terrible execution. Yes, I have to admit that out of like over 50 TV series, I haven't seen them all. But I'm sure each TV series, many of many Gundam fans have the one that they were both introduced to and then their favorite, which may not necessarily be the same, but yeah. Um, Omen says G Gundam was probably my favorite, but everybody else hates it. Yeah, it's one of those things where you have it's the Doctor Whoism of Gundam, where my favorite Doctor is the one I was introduced to. That's kind of how it works. And now, mind you, like I said, maybe there's a Gundam series where you're like, oh, that sucked, but then like two series later, you're like, man, that's a great one. Or maybe you go back in time. Yeah, like Tesla says, basically the Japanese equivalent of Star Trek. Yeah, everybody's got their favorite captain, and don't tell them otherwise. That's the best captain. Usually, like I said, usually the one you're introduced to. But the enduring nature of the Gundam series, I think, is something we can play with as far as tabletop role playing games and even Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Before we get into like, running mechs in a fantasy game, or because of course there's there's a glut of mecha games out there. As a matter of fact, like the uh, the mecha game formed off of the Black Hack from the Absolute Tabletop guys I own. I think it's a really good, simple system to use. It's I don't know. Anyway, there's a ton of mech games, but Battle Mech and Deadman says I prefer the Mobile Suit Gundam. Is it? I've never heard it said out loud. So is it Mobile Suit Gundam 00 or Mobile Suit Gundam 00? Mobile Suit Gundam Aught? I've never heard it pronounced for some reason because I kind of faded out of the Gundam at that point because remember the whole Gundam series actually spawned so many other series that many of us were like, well, when we got into that, we were introduced to other things, or in many ways, we were reintroduced back into it, if that makes a lot of sense. But much like there are some traditional parts of Gundam that I think created this like core essential value of why people like it so much. And Double O, okay, thank you there, Tesla. Yeah, Double O, like 007, because there's what is it's like 0087, 0080, and like it's the different series that came out based on the timeline of when the Gundam series started, and then there's divergent timelines because some ignore the the resultant history of certain series. Anyway, so anyway, there's some core essential things in Gundam that I think keeps it alive, and while they may be simple, just combining the proper layers of them each is cool. Like for example, the way it looks. I mean, visually, we can't argue with the fact that here's a giant robot that's based on okay. See, realism is the wrong word to use. There is some verisimilitude within the Gundam series because they try as they might, they try to create some form of pseudoscience as to why the Gundams look and behave the way they do, whether it's sensor nets or the power source, or you know planetary systems and gravity. They try to keep that in there and still have damn thing look good. Um, when you take a look at some of the Gundams over the years, you're like, there's so much crap hanging off the edge of these robots with weapons that are like weapon systems that are long and phallic. It's like, wait a minute, you can't have this thing moving and structurally sound the way it moves, and we love it for that purpose anyway, right? I'm not criticizing it, but in the sense of like I hate it. I just know that you can still love a thing and kind of poke fun at it as well without needing to change it, and I love it because each of the artists that creates a different generation of a Gundam suit, man, it's like wow. Um, Owen says, "What is that Ching thingy they have? Do you mean like? Are you talking like the pseudo transformative ability, or the different weapons or something like that? Because they, from kind of a pseudo staff spear kind of thing to a giant, I don't know, cannon linked to their chest and all that kind of stuff. There's always something. Oh yeah. Was that the Devil or Demon Gundam? I can't remember. I can't remember their Omen. Yeah, it says Omen says G Gundam was the worst offender though in my book, such as the snake body Gundam. Uh, yeah, every artist and creator tries to put their own spin on a thing, and then you look at it like let's just ignore that. Much like I ignore clone Peter Parker. The Spider-Man series. Deadman says the Gundam suits in Double O were named O1, O2, O3, and O4 in the first season. They were rebuilt into the O5M, O6, O7, and O8. And late in the season, they found the first Gundam Double O. I did not know. Well, I kind of knew that. I guess I just haven't kept up on my Gundam histories and stuff. Yeah. Oh, the chin thing. You mean the literal chin thing? That's dude. That's flavor. That's a flavor saver right there. Like nice and pointy. Got the little chin out here. Got a little bit of a upturned baseball cap thing going on the top of the head. Yeah. Yeah, that's what that is. That's a flavor saver right there. I mean, come on. How cool is it to like turn your back to explosions, man? You can't get any cooler than that. And and better to do it in a mech suit than than anything, right? But also the idea of like you have to have a lone hero, semi rebellious, who's out to save humanity or the countryside or a space habitat or something like that. Basically like a lone gunslinger. That's always a very good common thing to have, surrounded by some loyal, if somewhat intrusive friends and or family or coworkers or other heroes who are there to try to help you out. You also have to have like a little core group of people who are maybe not quite as capable. So the Gundam pilots got to go in and save them as well, even though they're trying to do their best to help out. So they're kind of like sacrificial buddies in many ways. And so telling these stories with like you have of course all the mix of science where someone tries to improve on something that doesn't need improving, or the oldie but goodie comes back from the dead and is able to like trounce the new kid on the block or something like that. Those are some classic stories, and doing it in a giant power suit where you're blasting people in reentry on planets or out there in the void of space with a soundtrack behind you and action lines. It's kind of cool. Now, when it comes to role playing games, there's a plenty of mecha role playing games. Much like playing like a horror game or cyberpunk, or what are some other genres? Heck, even trying to play like a teenage romance game, we all have to accept something. And one of the things that we have to accept in, mecha role-playing games is that the pilot as a separate entity from the mecha for many games primarily is ignored. Sure, the pilot is a fully formed character with a personality, and we can role play their antics outside the mech, but we're not really interested in their capabilities outside of them. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't games that give you stats for how fast and quick you are, how attractive you are. Maybe you have a piano playing skill or something like that. But really, do we really care about that? Not really, because what we want are the pilots to jump back into their mechs and get back into the action. So a lot of mecha style role playing games involve like upgrading the mech, places to repair the mech, how to adjudicate damage to the mech. Of course, there's always power sources and running out of power and additional weapons you can use. And of course, the pilot has some sort of additional capability that makes them piloting the mech better than everybody else, whether it is a leadership skill and they're able to help out their allies, to being very extremely maneuverable or able to push just a little bit more out of their mech. Stop. All right. Omen says badass beard. While several characters qualify, it's worth noting that the red beard protrusion is one of the defining features of the Gundam distinctive faceplate after the V-fin. Yeah. Oh, and the V-fin there. Yeah. Hey, good morning. Omen goes on to say the mecha themselves, yeah, they got that little thing on their chin. Starfinder's still introducing its own, but Mutants and Mastermind 3 already has its mecha already. I didn't know that. Yep, there's also the Robotech RPG by Palladium. I've played the Robotech Palladium game quite a bit, and I still love it to this day. And Robotech is another one that was after around the time of Gundam. I don't know which was first, like a chicken or the egg, whether it was Gundam or the original Robotech series, but that's also another thing that's introduced in the Gundam series in terms of an air quotes real mecha versus like fantasy mecha, in the sense that the Gundams were part of a militarization, and they just had different modifications to them. And in other words, they were the militarization of them meant that they were off the line mechs, and then each pilot had their own, like whether one was a fast attack wing, one was a defensive one was had a sensor array and modified that way. Much like in the Robotech series, they had the same thing where they were like heavy. Oh, what were their names? They're going down another pathway. The Veritex, the various Veritex in the Robotech series, of course, could transform, and then some were faster than others. Some had heavier armor. Some carried, a heavier payload of ordnance, and et cetera, et cetera. But you could potentially, as a role player, like you could pick. It was very easy to insert various pilots in it because it was very militarized. They built hundreds more, and you go ahead and pilot a couple more. Not hundreds, but you get my point, right? And as opposed to the one-off where there's only one giant robot and there's only one pilot, and we just have to hope that one pilot keeps the mech alive, or else, right? Moving maybe into like the Voltron era of like, oh, there's only 5 of them, and they were encased in stone and rock and underwater for all these years and whatnot. Yeah, Ricker says, is this where we talk about the Mecha Hack game? Yeah, I made an allusion to the Mecha Hack game. There's a second supplement to it that's on Kickstarter. If it hasn't already been Kickstarted already, you guys can look up the Mecha Hack, of which I do own the game, and it's pretty good. I love the simplicity of it. I'm a man of a certain age who loves RPG zines now, like 60 pages, 80 pages or less in a like a smallish book styled format. You could just put in you can almost roll it and put it in your back pocket or something. I'm kind of into that. Now, as far as like classic role playing games, throughout history, there has always been this love of mecha and trying to introduce them into like a fantasy setting. And in some ways, while it does seem a little bit incongruous, there's something to be said that mecha really do fit into fantasy, because there's mecha fighting giant monsters has always been a thing. And so the fact that those giant mechas are doing it in a different time era really doesn't change too much. Although you do have to think about the fact of like, it does add a different spin on it when the pilot themselves can like cast spells and things like that. It's kind of weird, but not too weird if you start to think about it. It's not too far-fetched when you think about all the fantasy that's out there. It's like, that's all right. I guess the one thing that would be very difficult to, the Mecha Hack has already, it's the mission manual. The Mecha Hack mission manual. The Mecha Hack based off of the Black Hack is already existent. But the Mecha Hack mission manual is another one. And it, of course, more weapons, more options for players and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. Rickard says, you go on and pilot a couple more. More no, you lose one more mech, okay? Maybe you get a new one. 2, better have a really good excuse there. 3, nope, you ain't getting a new one. Yeah, the idea of like scavenging for parts and uh, man, I mean, because Gundam since it started out in like 1979, it's kind of it's like the progenitor of everything that we know afterwards, right? Like the in the comic books, there's a character known as the Punisher, and in the Punisher is like one of the comic book's original vigilantes. While there's so many that have come later after it, this was kind of the progenitor of it. So the idea of like modifying mechs and having new power sources and using, big ass giant laser swords and carrying a big ass cannon on your back that's powered by a giant solar array or something like that. All those kind of weirdisms in our favorite, after that, our favorite mecha game, uh, television and movies, has come about from those kind of things. Yeah, yeah. Like Omen says, I got a buddy who absolutely hated the idea of sticking mecha in an older age. Yeah, like she said, how can a mounted horseman keep up with a metal giant? Right, and you know what? That is one of the problems with mecha games, is the dichotomy between the squishy humans, the squishy player characters, and then the super giant mechas. In the Palladium game, they came up with something known as mega damage. So they have SDC, structural damage. I don't know what the C stands for, but anyway, there was SDC, which was structural damage, and then it was MDC, which was mega damage. And mega damage was literally 100 times structural damage. So if you're playing, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons, and you've got, I don't know, you're starting out at a low level, you've got 27 hit points, and I've got my longsword that does a die 8 damage, and you go up against a mega damage mecha in Palladium game, and the person playing Palladium's like, yeah, my mech's only got 27 MDC, and yeah, my giant, I don't know, mono vibro blade only does a die 8 damage. Well, compared to the human, no, you don't have 27 hit points. You've got 2,700 hit points. And yeah, that little measly little die 8, I don't know, micro sword or something like that, it's like does 1d8 times 100 damage. Yeah. Yeah, Ego Death remembers that. Yep, and SDC weapons cannot harm MDC objects. That is correct. Yeah. The C, was it capacity? Yeah, SDC, yep, structural damage capacity, mega damage capacity. Thank you very much for that. I my I always get a brain fart there, Ego Death. Um, Ego Death also says a fantasy mech could be made of wood, metal, or rock, and animated by magic with a position for the pilot, of course. And I suppose the problem with fantasy and mechas is that, in a modern sense, we have a lot of things that act as like obstacles for them. Giant buildings. We've got militarized. Uh, we have a um, military industrial complex that acts as another limiting factor for mechas. So we've got like tanks and explosions and bunkers and things. And in the fantasy realm, what's a bow and arrow going to do, right? You would have to fill the world with other things that are of an equal stature, and it's very difficult to do that in fantasy unless you really flip the script on your tr- Tolkien-esque fantasy world, right? It would have to be something that isn't like that at all, and but still, like I said, much like putting firearms in fantasy, some people are just like, I don't care how you explain it, I don't want it in there, so I can't argue with that. Um, Omen's like, Punisher is a property of Disney. Is this? There's something wrong with that phrase, but I love it. Rickard brings up the anime Escaflowne. Escaflowne is basically fantasy plus mech, and I don't know. I've never heard that before. Never heard that. Um, yeah. Yep, yep, yep. Uh, if you have mechs in an older age, you probably wouldn't have mounted cavalry, or at least not that serve the same function as in our world. Talking about the mounted horsemen trying to keep up with mechs, and that's the idea, right? Like if the players have access to this, mechs tend to be they tend to be the world beaters in the world of whatever they exist in. So you would have to have something of equal and opposite confrontation for them. Otherwise, it's just it's young kids stomping around the sandbox, right, with their big toys. That basically that's what it comes out to be. Yeah, Mufa says Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives has powered armor and giant swords in a fantasy setting. Is I don't remember if I've listened to that audiobook or not. I'll have to look that up. Escaflowne changes from a giant suit of armor to a flying horseman. I didn't know that there, Omen. I did not know. I have to look these things up. I would dare try to put some of these images into in the live broadcast, but I'm afraid of getting slammed shut. They're pretty strict on YouTube, probably Twitch as well, taking people's property. That's why I don't do it too often, or don't try to do it at all. To be honest with you, now going moving into, if you're someone who really is a person that really wants to do some kind of like mechanized things, of course I would absolutely suggest trying to find something like Dead Man brings up the idea of like different types of damage potentials, like in Exalted. If you want to make something up, I would suggest also try to fill the world out. I know people don't like the second Pacific Rim movie. While a lot of people didn't particularly like it, it did try to build a larger world of a world with giant mechas and with Jaegers and these giant kaiju monsters and such. And I think building a world where it's a little bit more intricate than just getting a giant robot and fight another giant robot um, really needs to be said. Like, for example, is there like in BattleTech, is there an honor system where you settle conflicts with giant robots, but the pilots are allowed to eject, and crushing the pilot is not a good thing? It's more like taking out the robot rather than taking out the mechanized unit rather than taking out the robot. Maybe that's a cultural portion of the thing, of the setting. Also, where does all the stuff come from? Like, is there an economy? Is there scavenging involved? Like, even if this is a fantasy mechanized kind of thing, um, what what level of design and power and status do we give to the people who are able to construct these things? Like, are they constructed through mundane means? Like, do people literally just cut down wood and stone and metal and forge them together? Or are random pieces brought together and then a mage or a council of magi or a ritualist or something summon life into these things? Like, how does that work? Also, uh, again, player characters are, you give a player character flammables in a match, they're gonna set things on fire. What's to stop player characters, i.e., my CS Friedmanism, which is break the world, right? What happens when the mechas go wild and start trouncing the landscape? Who stops them? How are they stopped? Are they powered only for limited amounts of time? That used to be a thing back in a lot of old mecha stories where, like from Ultraman on, where it's like, hey, I can kick ass, but I've only got 10 minutes of energy and my energy's running down. Like, is that a thing? And so on and so forth. Rickard says if mechas are common, then you probably only use horses for labor and travel. It's like in Escaflowne, where you basically have about one mech per nation, then the rest of the army still have a purpose. Yeah. And uh, Yeah, he goes on to say they might serve as protection for the mecha, like how big naval ships have an entourage of smaller ships to protect it. They might be very rare, extremely expensive, and cost time and energy and resource consuming to build them in the first place. So that's also a possibility as well. If you want to make them far more rare, that they could be fragile, or they are using them as like using a nuke, right? Like once you put them on the battlefield and the player character is in the pilot seat, that was this was a decision that was the very last decision they had to make to solve the situation. Um, yeah, Rickard says, so we often forget to extrapolate. Like, why would you have horse cavalry when you have mages around every corner? Fireball plus cavalry mixes about as well as oil and water. Yeah. And oftentimes when we extrapolate, sometimes we like I'm a very bare bones, like I talk let's talk about the extrapolation of mecha and our role-playing games in general. So you take this idea, we have this premise, because we were talking about excellent premise, terrible execution, right? So you have an excellent premise. By the way, side note, a yet another mystery box show has aired on television here in the States called Debris. And so you have this premise of something, whether it's mecha, whether it's 3 years ago, a giant alien spacecraft we saw in space that was damaged, and now those pieces of debris are falling to the earth. And then you have to extrapolate out from that. And sometimes you can extrapolate from the top down or bottom up. I'm a bottom up person. Like, what, meaning, like, how does the average person live in the world, and what do they do in the world where these things exist? And then top down is like governments and world spanning ideas. And I'm a person like, okay, what's the person on the ground doing? And doing either of those means something. Like, for example, like people say, well, if you've got mages and fireballs, you don't need cavalry. And I'm thinking, sure, once, right? Because the minute you have somebody casting fireballs, human beings are going to do things to stop that, right? Like, oh, I don't know, bribery, theft, assassination, poison. Like they're not just going to let wizards go around casting fireballs at people. I mean, not that you could stop them, but you can stop them in other ways, like the use of seduction and deception and torture and things like that. The minute a wizard goes to sleep, there's going to be somebody somewhere that's going to start slitting throats, right? And so then the wizard needs to defend themselves, and then he's going to then here we go with bodyguards and cavalry and all that kind of stuff, right? And like any military leader knows, the minute you show your hand at your most powerful weapon, then you've already lost the advantage, right? So when it comes to extrapolating out things, like when it comes to mecha, where do the resources come from? You know, wet and wild cavalrymen. Oh yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking of the, what was it, mid 90s? I think was the Girls Going Wild videos. I'm just thinking of Girls Going Wild, but with like knights and and stuff like that. Yeah. Yep. Wet and wild cavalry. That'll stop the fireball thrower. Yeah. Just douse them with water and whatnot. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Cavalry wizards do before they ride by fireball. Yeah. Everybody says that, but like, there's a reason why you don't want to do certain things. Like, for example, oh, I don't know, fireballs set fire to countrysides or cities that you might want to, I don't know, keep safe. There's a little bit of that, and we tend to ignore the fact that like wizards with fireballs, that's one spell out of hundreds at least. Knights going wild. Sorry, just thinking of wet t-shirts and knights on horses and stuff like that. Sorry, but we ignore the fact that there's things like anti-magic, dispel magic. There are like, if you start to think about it, magic missile spell is probably more effective than fireball because the magic missile spell never misses, whereas the fireball is like a it's like a scatter shot, right? Whereas a magic missile is extremely precise. The king's watching the video horrified. Bring back my knights, and the knights are like, woo, wet and wild now. And the wizard's like, what the hell's going on? Why are they wetting themselves and flinging back their hair in slow motion? Rika says later Wheel of Time books show just how devastating mages can be to a battlefield. Basically, nothing other than other magi really work. That and then zerging them to burn them out. Yep, yep. And then there's also things like, is there a built-in safety valve in the world? Like role-playing games tend to ignore this part of it. Like how many times can you cast a spell? Does it tire you? Does it make you age? Does it summon other things? Does it open rifts in space? And I know those side effects aren't really a part of like Dungeons and Dragons and role playing, but there's other games where the industrialized use of magic um, can lead to terrible side effects. And so much like, since we take this back to Gundam, whether you have a power source that irradiates the countryside or might explode, or once you use your power unit, you have to recharge it, but it takes a long time to do it, and those kind of things. Like when you start to extrapolate out things, it's why in war we have infantry and tanks and bunker buster bombs and chemical warfare and landmines and things like that. Like, there's a reason why we have them, and there's a reason why we don't use them. And a fireball isn't a Swiss Army knife. It's one of a number of things. Yep. Like Rickard says, well, spell slots are basically magical stamina for the day. Exactly. So, when the mage stops casting fireball, then what happens, right? All you have to do is hunker down long enough to survive the onslaught, and then people are smart. Human beings have been able to do some pretty. We are brilliant at force multipliers, finding force multipliers, right? Human beings have been able to take out elephants and rhinoceroses and tigers with very little, very little energy involved, taking out very large beasts. Hell, humanity pretty much put whales on the many kind of whales on the endangered species list, and they are pretty powerful in their own element, and we still try to destroy most of them as well. So we're pretty industrious when it comes to things. Yeah, you know. Nuke door, irradiating the countryside, irradiating the peasants. Yeah. Although I'm imagining it would be kind of cool. Like Deadman puts in the Dragon Pilot is another way to do fantasy versions of Gundams. The Dragon Pilot, Hisone and Masaton, Netflix official site, recently stationed Air Defense Force rookie Hisone Amakasu is chosen by a dragon concealed within Gifu Air Base to be his pilot. Now, um, would dragon riders kind of be considered like could Daenerys riding on the dragon kind of be considered fantasy mech? Yes, I know riding on the back of a dragon is not exactly like being inside of a inside and encapsulated inside of a hardened system, but I think that fits thematically. I think that fits. Yeah, the peasants will mutate and become stronger. Right. Like, what kind of power source are they using? Are they capturing elementals and powering these damn things? The idea of, now, I suppose you could make it far more fantasy of druids residing inside of giant-sized elemental figures. Like, oh, I'm just gonna open up a space inside of a giant earth elemental that's basically a mountain, and then manipulate it that way. And I'm a merfolk that's inside of a giant ocean wave that's I don't know 20 times the height of the average man or something. Omen brings up there was also the anime Dragonaut, and dragons were mecha. I don't know, Mac. You guys are bringing up things. Man, I'm old. Don't get like me, guys, forgetting more than you remember. Or well endowed men or women getting irradiated. Like, ooh. Rickard says that is fair. That's when you change from Mecha Hack to Mutants and Mastermind. I don't have the third edition of that, but I hear it's really good. The Mutants and Masterminds, that is. You guys are bad. Omen, bad, bad. Rickard says shape-shifting druids are basically piloting a meat mech. Here we go with the meat mech. But true, titans and giants and all that kind of stuff. Kind of dragons, elementals, they kind of fit into that. Genie, maybe. The different types of Jinn and Ifrit and Marids, and I don't know all the names of the rest of them, but things that are huge and tall and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah. That's terrifying. I remember a buddy saying that Gamut McLean, who was a busty and evil Beyonce. Weird, but listen, we're not going down the hentai route. We are not doing that. No, no, yes, yeah. We are definitely not going that way. Luckily, these videos are not made for children. But um, the good thing that we can pull from Gundam, if we want to use that for our role playing games, the militarization of something. So it would, I think, despite the fact of me trying to poo poo on the idea, I like the idea of like mages and dragons and elementals and it being like a military force. I don't know if you guys know of a game setting that has taken fantasy and militarized it. I'm talking like literally on the battlefield. Now, yes, I suppose Warhammer 40K probably is the closest to it that I'm thinking of, but pure fantasy but militarized, taking all the fantasy elements and militarizing that on the battlefield. Like, hey, we've got ogres in the front line, and we've got harpies using aerial support, and we've got magi shooting lightning bolts off of magic carpets or something. Like, I don't know. But and then here come the big guns. Here comes the local castle we were trying to siege. Ooh, the castle's transforming and turning into a giant stone parapeted mecha with I don't know, gnomes using slingshots off the parapets at their enemies down below or something. Like, I don't know. Kind of fun, although you definitely would not have a traditional let's go into the dungeon. It wouldn't be. Yeah, Deadman says that would be Warhammer Fantasy Battles. That's what I'm thinking. I think that's it, I think. Riku says regarding mutants and masterminds, it's like it's okay if you want to spend a whole day trying to make a character, like 4+ hours. Yeah, that was the issue with the first edition of Eclipse Phase, right? They're like, here's this great game, and everyone's like, sweet, reading the book, and then you're like, hey, let's sit down and make characters. 3 days later, giant beards, like, all right, I've got part 1 done. That's sometimes the creation of something and the application of something don't match well together, unfortunately. Yeah. Exalted sound was kind of like that. Yeah, Exalted was like that. Yep. See, now that depends on what you define as fun, Mufa. And I'm not saying it's not. I have to go back to the 8 types of fun idea, right? Like, just like many of us suffer from world builders disease, there's also people who suffer from character building disease as well, and enjoy every minute of it, right? Like, sometimes there's games that are there's an element of them that are designed to be nothing but like character creation engines, and you're just like, man, there's so many combinations. What's the next cool combination I can come up with, right? And just like having world builders disease is the same thing. What kind of crazy outlandish worlds can I have? I need to get my mountains just right. I need to make sure I place my swamps in the correct location and have my, make my rivers, make sure they flow and separate and combine together in the best way and stuff. Many of us suffer from that, and I'm with you, Mufa. Yeah, making characters in Millions of Masterminds, although like first, second generation of them that I'm familiar with, like champions and stuff. Yeah, you can get into the weeds very easy. Like Omen says, that's why we that's just why we just look for pre-made characters online. Like my buddy would just say, I want to play as Moon Knight from Marvel or something like that. Yeah, there's a lot of, and listen, the internet has made things very easy for us. So you could very easily go into a forum, find what you want, snatch it up, you're done. Yeah, we didn't really talk too much about the deep the deep intricacies of the Gundam series, unfortunately. Although again, we could go down a huge rabbit hole when it comes to different series like that. But I will say that I'm a huge fan of like mecha combat and things, and much like the Pacific Rim. What was the second movie? Uprising or something? I mean, you had junkyards, you had corporations trying to get into it, and so I agree with RK in the sense that extrapolating out the world and how you want the world to operate, and not just focus on just let's have giant monsters fighting giant mecha fighting other giant mecha, or giant mecha just fighting other monsters. Fill out the world a little bit, and then come to a realization of like what does really makes up the world, But anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I've got to get out of here, but you guys have a great day. Thank you much for the salutations and everything. I appreciate it. Guys, have a great one. I'll see you. Bye. Have a great one. Thanks for watching.